Today's video is a twofer. I'm going to review the Phanteks Eclipse P200A mini-itx case by building a mini-itx home office PC with some decent gaming performance using the Ryzen 5 4650G. But this time I'm going to talk about it. Let's do this. Hey guys. Welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, and just a few days ago I posted a video where I just stood here silently and built this PC. I built the system as part of my review of this Phanteks Eclipse P200A mini-itx case. It's a pretty simple build. Under the Scythe Mugen 5 Black Tower cooler is the Ryzen 5 Pro 4650G, a 6-core 12-thread CPU with a 3.7 GHz base and a 4.2 GHz boost clock, and an 8-core integrated GPU operating at 1900 MHz. It's attached to an ASRock Fatality B450 gaming ITX motherboard, paired with 32 GB of G-Skill Trident Z DDR4 3200 CL16 memory and powered by a Corsair SF750 SFX power supply. Now, I did run into a couple issues when putting this all together, and I'll get to all that in a bit, but I need to work with it a little bit more to get a full picture of the P200A. So the plan today is, first, I'm going to make a few changes to this system. Not huge changes. The core system will be the same, but I'm going to replace the SFX power supply with a full-size Corsair CX750M. I'm going to replace the Scythe air cooler with this Enermax 240mm AIO, and replace the front 120mm case fans with these Inwin 140mm Jupiter fans. And that'll allow me to put one of the 120mm case fans back into the rear of the case and exhaust, because that was one of the issues I ran into with this case and this hardware configuration. The Mugen 5 is just too deep to fit in the case with a rear case fan installed. Not a huge problem because most of the air passing through the heatsink will just keep going right out the back of the case, but some of it will rise, which is the second minor issue I ran into, because the PSU is top mounted and the top of the case is completely closed. The PSU fan needs to face down, which means it's right above the heatsink, sucking in some of that hot air. Now, to minimize this as much as possible, I attempted to mount the PSU on the SFX adapter plate in a way which would place it as high as possible in the case. Unfortunately, in that configuration, when connected to the case PSU plate, the thumb screws wouldn't line up, so I had to flip the adapter plate, lowering the PSU by a few centimeters. Now, I think this is probably intentional by Phanteks, so it's impossible to mount the PSU with the fan facing up all the way jammed up against the top of the case. As it is, if I flip the PSU over, there's still a few centimeters of space above where the fan can still draw air, and honestly, with this titanium rated PSU, it probably wouldn't be a problem. However, I still don't recommend that. Other than that, the case was great to build in, but I'll let you know what I think of the full build experience once I get the rest of the parts installed. And then I'm just going to play some games so you guys can get an idea of how the 4650G and this system performs. And finally, mostly to do my due diligence, I'll plug a graphics card in to see how this performance version of the P200A performs. And we'll also get to see how the 4650G can drive a dedicated GPU in gaming performance. Okay, that's it. Let's get this pulled apart and put back together again. All right, configuration 2 is done, and building this, I realized I need to do a third configuration. I'll get to that in a bit. First, let's talk about the case and the build experience thus far. Now, this isn't going to be one of my typical launch day reviews where I go over all the specs and do noise level and thermal testing. This case has been out for a couple weeks and has been pretty thoroughly reviewed in the traditional manner. So what I'm going to do today is just give you my overall thoughts on the case and the build experience. To start, overall, just like the rest of the Phanteks Eclipse mesh lineup, I really like the case. Now, while this is technically an ITX case, it's, well, pretty gargantuan for an ITX case. Think NZXT H210, but even bigger. Now, this allows for a lot of flexibility in component selection, like a full-size ATX power supply, a 240 millimeter radiator with 2 mounting positions, 120 or 140 millimeter fans in the front, and pretty much any graphics card made. With a caveat, I'll get to that. But you are limited to just mini-itx motherboards, or the one Asus mini-DTX board is also compatible. Micro-ATX is not an option. So with all this room and options, let's talk about the build experience. I already talked a bit about the initial build with the SFX power supply and air cooler, but there were a couple things I forgot. One of the other issues is the pass-through for the CPU power cable isn't big enough to fit the 8-pin cable through. I had to split it into the 4-pin configuration to get it through. This was also a problem for the PCIe power cable. I initially wanted to pass this cable through this opening down here, but it just wouldn't fit. Now, this probably isn't where the cable is intended to be passed through, but it made sense to do it for reasons you'll see in a bit. As far as cable management, with the first configuration, the fully modular SF750, only 2 fans, no RGB cables at all, well, it was effortless. Now, with the ATX power supply, with its longer and bulkier cables, 5 fans, 4 of which have 2 wires each, well, you need to be more intentional with your planning. Now, again, huge ITX case and lots of room back there for cables, but there is no PSU shroud or basement to just shove your excess wires into. Plus, with the side-mounted AIO, you have to avoid that whole area. So one of the choices I made was daisy-chainable fans. I was able to daisy-chain the in-wind fans together and even connect the rear case fan to them. That way, I could cut down on excess splitter cables. The RGB cables are even daisy-chainable. I was able to daisy-chain the front fans and the AIO fans together, connecting them all to a single ARGB header on the motherboard and avoiding the need for any type of RGB controller. Then a few zip ties and the included brackets and Velcro straps, and it all fit nicely behind the panel, and I didn't even need the thumb screw to keep the panel on. Now, let's get to the reason why I need a third and then a fourth configuration to test the system. Because with the AIO side mounted like this, my RTX 2080 Ti just won't fit. The radiator sticks out, limiting the length of your GPU to about 200 to 205 millimeters. But there is a solution, well, besides the obvious of just mounting the AIO to the front of the case. This case can be configured to vertically mount the GPU. I just need to make a couple changes. First, the rear fan needs to be removed, then I can unscrew the PCIe expansion slots and flip them vertically. I also have to flip the AIO radiator. I mounted it tubes down, mostly so I don't get stupid comments. You mounted the AIO wrong. Tubes up is fine. The pump will still be like 6 or 7 inches below the top of the radiator. What would be very bad is vertically mounting the graphics card against the AIO tubes. You never want to touch your AIO tubes to your GPU's backplate or heatsink. The backplate on this 2080 Ti can get over 80 degrees Celsius, which will damage the AIO tubes. So If the only way to mount your AIO with the tubes down results in having to then stretch those tubes across your graphics card, just don't. Okay, rant over. Let's mount this GPU, or, well, pseudo-mount it. I unfortunately don't have a PCIe riser cable that's compatible with this case. I can try to jerry-rig the ones I have to fit, but I'm not gonna gamble with my currently irreplaceable graphics card. So I'll show you how the vertical mounting system works, but for actual testing the system with the dedicated graphics card, I'll reconfigure the case a fourth time by reinstalling an air cooler, a skinnier one so I can keep the rear fan, and then I'll mount the RTX 2080 Ti in its default horizontal position. Okay, rebuilding again. All right, to convert to the vertical mode, we're gonna take these two screws off to remove the PCIe expansion slots, and this screw off to remove the expansion panel. Now we can flip this vertically. And this panel will go back on here. Just replace these two screws. And now I have a 2-slot card, so I'm going to remove this first and second PCIe expansion cover. And then if I had a compatible PCIe riser cable, it would screw in here and here. But I can still demonstrate. Then you have your vertically mounted GPU. You can see the compatible PCIe riser cable needs to be off the floor of the case. Unfortunately, the two that I have both mount flush to the case. But the nice thing about this and the performance case that I selected, is the vertically mounted GPU lines up with the vent in the side of the case, so you can draw in nice fresh air through there. Okay, config 4. I pulled the AIO, but I left the fans. I just flipped them so they're intake now, because why not? But really, I just didn't have time to rewire again. To cool the 4650G, I installed the Enermax ETS F40. This is further proof of just how big this little case is. This is a 140 millimeter cooler with a height of 158 millimeters, and there's still room. I was even able to daisy chain the cooler RGB into the other fans. I know, too much RGB in general really, but especially for a solid panel case. But this case does come in a tempered glass version too. But let's get the side panel on and get to gaming. Now, I'll start with just a couple games on the Ryzen 4650G iGPU, but if you want to see gaming performance for this and most of the Ryzen APUs, there's a link to that video in the description below too. But let's start with Warzone.
Well done. The upper right part of your HUD shows how many enemies are ammo. Other special items. Hostile dropping into the area. Gas is
Heroes never die. Where does it go?
Pass into the iris.
What is that? Off in the distance.
It's a ship. Look at the size of it.
Where is it? Okay, so the Ryzen 5 4650G is a pretty competent gaming APU and a great stopgap while waiting and praying for a graphics card. And when you do get a new GPU, it's still a great CPU, being roughly equivalent to a stock R5 3600, coming in just under the 3600 in gaming performance, due mostly to a smaller L3 cache size. So let's go for the final configuration of the system. What are we up to? 5, 6 configurations? Anyway, it's time to install the RTX 2080 Ti, fire up Cyberpunk 2077, and see how the system performs. Now, I don't expect any problems with the system in gaming performance. Again, the 6-core 12-thread CPU will drive the 2080 Ti just fine. I also don't expect GPU temps to be a problem with all the fans I got in here and the mesh side panel. This graphics card gets up to 80 or even 85 degrees in my Fractal Mesh Phi 2, which is the best airflow case I've ever owned. Let's see how it does in the Phanteks P200A. Okay, I know I said Cyberpunk, but Cyberpunk wasn't loaded onto this clean Windows install, and after like 3 hours, it was only about 30% downloaded. So I'm switching over to Outriders because I already had that on my game drive.
Think you could take on a tank? Nice. Haven't lost your touch.
One of those cow things is sunning itself right on my path.
Hey, maybe he can get close enough to get a DNA sample.
Not exactly our priority, but if I can get close without spooking it, I'll try. Nah, scared it off, but I've secured the objective.
Fantastic.
Got some kind of storm brewing.
After almost 20 minutes of gameplay, the GPU peaked at 83 Celsius, meaning the P200A is right in line with the best airflow cases I've worked with. Of course, I do have the performance version, and honestly, it works. With the GPU in its standard horizontal position, most of the hot air from it was being blown right out the side mesh here. So if you're looking to build a slightly smaller PC but don't want to go all the way down to the serious mini-itx enclosures like a Fractal Node 202 or something like an Ncase M1, if you're looking for something equivalent to the NZXT H210 but with more options and better airflow, then this is a good choice. There will be links to this case as well as all the components I used in this video in the description below. Everything I used in this build, with the exceptions of the graphics card, is available at least at the time of filming, and you can build out the PC in its original form or configuration 1 for about $950 if you can grab the 4650G for about $300, which you should be able to do right now. That's not a bad deal considering that's what a single RTX 2070 is going for right about now. It's a decent esports or console port gaming PC in a great case, ready for a drop-in GPU upgrade when and if the silicone situation ever rectifies itself. Anyway, if you want more info and benchmarks on the Ryzen 5 4650G, there's a couple of links in the description below. While you're down there, be sure to hit that like. It does help get the content from a small channel like mine out to more viewers, and maybe consider subscribing for more tech-related content. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe.